I never imagined how drastically one phone call could change the course of my life. For years, I was convinced my desires belonged to the past. But then I stepped into that hotel suite, heart pounding with anticipation, and discovered a part of myself I thought was gone forever. This is the story of how I, Sarah Thompson, found forbidden passion in the most unexpected way, and the lengths I went to keep it alive. My story. My name is Sarah Thompson. I'm 58 years old, widowed for almost a decade, and by all accounts, a perfectly respectable woman. If you saw me strolling down Michigan Avenue in Chicago, you'd think there goes a poised lady, probably a retired professional of some kind, maybe a teacher or a businesswoman. You wouldn't be wrong. I spent over 30 years of my life in education, dedicating myself to my work and my family. I thought I knew exactly who I was and what I stood for. But here's the truth. Deep inside, I felt empty. After my husband, Mark, passed away, I promised myself never to let anyone else into my heart. He'd been my first real love, my companion through thick and thin. Somehow, I believed if I dared to love again, I'd be betraying his memory. As the years stretched on, though, I realized I was also betraying myself, my need for emotional warmth, for physical connection, for feeling alive. Everything changed one chilly afternoon in January. I was sitting in my small apartment, flipping through daytime TV. I remember sipping peppermint tea, feeling restless. My daughter Caroline, who lives in Seattle, had called earlier to chastise me for not taking better care of my health. She said I sounded off. She didn't realize my loneliness was reaching a tipping point. My older friends had their own busy lives, my retired colleagues were traveling the world, and here I was alone, uncertain, and craving something I couldn't even name. That's when I found an ad on my laptop, a discreet corner of the internet that offered companionship services. I hesitated, heart pounding, as I scrolled through photos of men who looked too good to be real. It felt surreal, like peering through a keyhole into a hidden world. First, I told myself it was just curiosity, but my gaze kept drifting toward one profile in particular. A young man named Ethan. Tall, confident smile, dark hair, and eyes that hinted at warmth and understanding. I clicked on his image, read his bio. Early 20s, offers conversation, travel companionship, or simple nights out on the town. I felt my breath catch. Was I really considering this? I kept the tab open for nearly a week, returning to it day after day, each time thinking, this is ridiculous. You're old enough to be his mother, or even older. My rational brain screamed no, but my heart fluttered with a thrill I hadn't felt in years. At some point, reason gave way. I found myself drafting a short message to Ethan through the website's private messenger. Something polite and vague. I'm interested in meeting to talk. It's been a long time since I've had company. I blushed so hard I thought my cheeks might catch fire. I expected no response or a polite refusal. But 2 hours later, a notification lit up my screen. Sarah. I'd be happy to meet. We can talk about what you're looking for and see if we connect. Let me know what works for you. I stared at those words like they were a portal to another dimension. What am I doing? I asked myself over and over. But I knew. I was searching for a spark of life in a long gray winter. I typed back, setting a time and date, choosing a hotel in downtown Chicago, a place I assumed offered both discreet check-in and a well-appointed bar. When the day came, I arrived at the Drake Hotel with shaky knees. That stately building had always impressed me with its old-world elegance. I checked into a room under my maiden name, 𝐦𝐨𝐬𝐬, as if that small deception might shield me from the shock of what I was about to do. The suite was lovely, soft lighting, plush carpet, a view of Lake Michigan. I tried to calm my nerves by unpacking a few items. A neatly folded navy dress, a pair of black heels, toiletries. My reflection in the mirror showed a woman who still looked put together, but with time's subtle traces. Fine lines around the eyes, a faint sag around the jaw. Why would a young man find me the least bit appealing? My insecurity whispered. Just as I finished pacing the length of the room for the 10th time, a quiet knock sounded on the door. My heart lurched. I hesitated, then opened it. There he stood, Ethan. He wore a casual but stylish blazer, dark jeans, and a confident half-smile that didn't quite mask his own curiosity. He was even more handsome in person, which almost made me panic. But his eyes were kind, and he greeted me softly. Good evening, Sarah.
𝐬𝐸𝐬𝐿.
Thanks for inviting me. I managed a nervous smile, stepping aside to let him in. He moved with a certain grace, as though he'd done this many times before. We faced each other in the living area of the suite, a swirl of tension saturating the air. He broke the silence. "Would you like to sit down? Maybe a drink first, to loosen the mood." With stiff fingers, I poured us each a glass of Merlot from the room's minibar selection. I rarely drank anything more than the occasional glass of wine at holiday dinners, so I felt the warmth in my stomach right away. Ethan took a small sip, then asked, "So, what are you looking for tonight? Just conversation? A companion? Something more physical?" His honesty caught me off guard. My hands trembled around the wine glass. The truth was, I didn't know. I only knew I wanted to feel alive. So I answered in a hushed voice, I've been alone for a long time, Ethan. I don't have a set plan. I just want to talk, maybe more if it feels right. I'm sorry, I'm not used to any of this." He nodded, easing back into the plush armchair, crossing one ankle over his knee. "Don't apologize. Honestly, I work with a variety of people. My job is to make sure you feel comfortable, whatever that means for you. If you change your mind about anything, just say the word." His reassuring tone coaxed the tension from my shoulders, but my heart still raced. We started with small talk. He asked about my background, and I revealed I'd been a schoolteacher for many years, that I'd raised a daughter mostly on my own after my husband's passing. In return, Ethan spoke about how he'd tried different jobs, bartending, waiting tables, some retail, before stumbling into the world of companionship. The money was better, he admitted, and he discovered he had a knack for helping people feel at ease. A half hour melted away in surprisingly comfortable conversation. He never made me feel judged or pathetic, though he surely saw the lines of worry on my face. I found myself confiding more than I ever expected. How my daughter seemed distant, how I regretted never traveling the world, how I turned into this anxious, lonely woman. Eventually, Ethan set down his wine. "Sarah," he said gently, "is there anything specific you'd like tonight that would make you happier? Even if it's something small." I looked into his eyes that were calm, steady, and surprisingly empathetic for someone so young. I let out a long breath, feeling a surge of daring. I want to be touched, I thought. I want to feel like a desirable woman again. But the words lodged in my throat. I simply nodded, tears pricking my eyelids. He got up and sat next to me on the sofa, placing a hand over mine. The contact of his warm skin against mine sent a spark through my body. We ended up in a slow, tender embrace that night. Nothing overly explicit, but enough to wake something buried within me. When he left the next morning, I felt an odd mixture of relief and longing. Second meeting, the list. Days turned into a restless blur. My mind spun with questions. What have I started? Will I do it again? Did I cross some moral boundary? Despite my jumbled emotions, I reached out to Ethan once more. Perhaps I was addicted to the feeling of being seen. Or maybe I just needed more closure. When we arranged a second meeting, I booked a different hotel downtown, somewhere we wouldn't risk staff recognizing us. Leading up to that evening, I wrote something in a small floral print notebook I'd hidden in my bedside drawer. A bucket list. If you will, ideas, fantasies, experiences I'd never had the courage to try. Some were innocent enough. Dancing in the rain, singing karaoke in front of strangers. Others were more intimate, things I never admitted to anyone. My hands shook as I wrote them, but a certain excitement replaced my old fear. The second time I saw Ethan, he showed up in a fitted sweater and dark trousers. He carried a quiet confidence, but I sensed genuine curiosity too. We sat on the couch, the city lights below us, sipping a little whiskey, something stronger than wine. My nerves fluttered. I pulled the little notebook from my purse, hesitating. I made a list. I began, voice quivering with both embarrassment and thrill, of things I've never done. His eyebrows rose in interest. "Okay, wanna share?" I nodded, flipping past the tamer entries, drawn to the riskier items. My cheeks burned, but I pressed on. I want to do something unusual. Maybe roleplay, or try new ways of being intimate." He leaned closer, scanning my face. "I'm open to that. We can go at your pace. But only if you feel safe." Relief washed over me, mingling with electric tension. I told him about some fantasies I'd had. Nothing too graphic, but definitely outside my usual comfort zone. The conversation felt both nerve-wracking and liberating. I was the one guiding the session now, not him. We laughed, we teased, and we kissed longer and with more urgency than the first time. Eventually, we put the notebook aside, deciding we'd attempt something new that night. Just one item, a baby step, so to speak. Before we could start though, my phone rang, my daughter's ringtone. Guilt plunged into my stomach. I fumbled for the phone, answered. Caroline sounded upset about a situation at her job. She needed someone to vent to, maybe a solution. As I tried to focus on her words, Ethan gently squeezed my shoulder. I found it impossible to concentrate. My mind darted between motherly concern and the heated presence beside me. I eventually promised Caroline I'd call her back. By the time I hung up, my mood had soured. Ethan noticed my anxiety, turned on some soft music from his phone, and coaxed me into a slow dance in the middle of the suite. I let my body lean into his, inhaling his subtle cologne. My heart pounded with the confusion of longing and guilt. Something about that moment, the city lights twinkling through floor-to-ceiling windows, his arms steady around me, untangled the tightness in my chest. I admitted how guilty I felt for ignoring my daughter's crisis, while I indulged in my own secrets. I get it, Ethan murmured. But sometimes you have to choose yourself, even for just a moment. We danced for a while, the whiskey loosening my inhibitions. Eventually, we tried one of the simpler items on my list, a form of playful roleplay that had me giggling like a teenager, forgetting my age and responsibilities. It wasn't raunchy, but it was definitely more intimate than anything I'd done in years. The sense of freedom was exhilarating, though a small, persistent voice reminded me, this is not who you are, Sarah. Or maybe it is who I am, and I just never allowed it to surface. In the early hours, I woke to find Ethan still there. We lay side by side, not quite entangled, but not distant either. In the half-darkness, I confessed that I felt torn between wanting to explore more and feeling like I was betraying my family's memory. Instead of judging, he listened. Then as dawn approached, we parted ways. I paid him, though he hesitated, telling me he cared more about my comfort than the money. I insisted though, maintaining that boundary felt necessary for my own sanity. Spicy interlude number 1. Sometime after the second meeting, we arranged a rendezvous in a small cabin near a lake just outside Chicago, a more secluded spot. I'd read about couples going on private getaways, and though couple was hardly the right word for us, the idea thrilled me. This time, I wanted something more adventurous. We planned an afternoon together. We'd cook, talk, maybe even dip our feet in the water if the weather allowed. When we arrived, the cabin was rustic, with a cozy fireplace and a narrow wooden deck leading down to a silent lake. The early evening sun cast golden rays across the water. We opened a bottle of wine, laughing as we tried to get the old cork out. Then we ended up cooking a simple meal side by side. Ethan chopping vegetables, me stirring sauce, playful banter passing between us. It felt almost normal, almost like we were truly a couple on a romantic getaway. After dinner, a quiet hush fell over the place. We ventured outside, sitting on the deck. I wore a light sweater, clutching my glass of wine. The hush of the wind through tall pines surrounded us, and I realized how rarely I experienced such calm. Something in that moment shattered my inhibitions. I set my glass aside and turned to him, heart pounding. I want a skinny dip, I blurted, surprising even myself. Ethan's eyes widened, a half-grin forming on his lips. Out there? It's probably freezing. I shrugged, adrenaline flooding my veins. This is one of those crazy items on my secret list, I reminded myself. Yes, but I want to feel alive. And so we did. We walked down to the water's edge, the moon reflecting off gentle ripples. I can't lie, my heart hammered with both fear of exposure and the thrill of doing something so out of character. We peeled off our clothes in the faint moonlight, and I stepped into the water first, biting back a shriek as cold waves lapped at my thighs. Ethan joined me, and we found ourselves waist-deep, giggling like teenagers playing hooky. The water was bracing, yes, but the sense of wild freedom was indescribable. He moved closer, arms wrapping around me. The physical jolt of his bare skin on mine in that chilly lake brought goosebumps from head to toe. We kissed, slow and passionate, water dripping from our hair. For that moment, I was not a widow in her late 50s. I was just Sarah, an adventurous, desirous woman stepping far outside her old cautious life. When we finally waded out, shivering and breathless, we wrapped up in thick towels, our laughter echoing among the trees. Back in the cabin, we warmed ourselves by the fireplace, the heat from the flames teasing across our damp bodies. Ethan massaged my shoulders, tracing gentle patterns along my back. That night marked a turning point. It was the first time I fully let go of the internal condemnation about age, morality, or social norms. For a few glorious hours I basked in the possibility that maybe I deserved happiness, no matter how fleeting. We ended up in a swirl of shared warmth, the flickering firelight dancing across our skin as we merged in something deeper than a mere transaction. Third meeting, the conflict. The next time we met in a hotel room, back to the city environment, my resolve to stay purely casual with Ethan dissolved further. I felt an ache in my chest every time we parted. Am I falling in love? The notion was terrifying, because Ethan had never pretended this was anything more than business. True, he showed genuine kindness, but that was part of his job. Still, I found myself wanting to know every detail about him. Did he have siblings? Hobbies? Dreams for the future? One evening while we sat on the edge of a king-sized bed, I asked these questions. He tensed, pulling away slightly. "Sarah, this is crossing professional lines," he said quietly. "I keep my personal life separate for a reason." A flush of embarrassment heated my face, but my emotions overrode caution. I confessed that I'd been trying to learn more about him online, searching for his real name, glimpses of his history. I just wanted to know the man behind the easy smile. Maybe it was my teacher instinct, or a lonely widow's heart hoping for real connection. Regardless, the moment I admitted that, I saw anger flare in his eyes. "You did what?" he snapped, voice low. "Sarah, that's not okay. You know how important privacy is in my line of work." I stammered an apology, explaining that I'd grown attached, that I thought we shared enough trust that I could dig a bit deeper. Ethan stood up abruptly, crossing his arms. He told me that while he sympathized with my situation, he didn't appreciate me crossing boundaries. I panicked, tears brimming. I can pay you more," I blurted. "I can give you whatever you want, just don't walk out. I need you." He frowned, shaking his head. "It's not about the money. It's about respect. You broke my trust." Desperate, I stooped to a low tactic, threatening him that I might reveal his real occupation to whomever was in his life if he left me. Immediately, I knew I'd gone too far. His expression morphed from anger to hurt, then something else, sorrow. He let out a shaky breath, tears welling up in his own eyes. "You don't understand," he said softly. "My mom left me when I was a teenager. I spent years trying to find her. When I finally saw her 2 years ago, she pretended not to know me and walked away. I've had enough betrayal in my life, Sarah. I can't do this with you." My heart twisted. I realized how gravely I'd misjudged him by thinking I could manipulate him into staying. He confessed that, ironically, he'd come to care for me more than he intended, that I was more than a mere client. But after this breach of trust, he couldn't continue. He apologized for raising his voice, said he'd refund the remainder of any money. Then he walked out, leaving me with a crushed heart and a raging storm of regret. Spicy interlude number 2, the surprise encounter. In the days that followed, I sank into a deep gloom. I alternated between blaming myself and feeling as though the world had conspired to take Ethan away. Perhaps to soothe my anguish, I decided to escape Chicago for a weekend. I drove 3 hours north to a smaller town where nobody knew me, booking a quaint B&B that boasted a relaxing spa. On my second night there, I wandered down the street to a quiet bar. To my shock, as I sipped a vodka tonic at the counter, I glimpsed a familiar silhouette in one corner. Ethan. He was sitting with a woman around his age, but they didn't look romantic, more like casual acquaintances. My stomach twisted. Should I approach him or leave? Before I could decide, he noticed me. Our eyes locked. An awkward wave passed between us. The woman stepped away to use the restroom, and Ethan slipped over to me, hands in his pockets. Up close, my heart hammered. "Hey," he said softly. "I didn't expect to see you here. Are you okay?" Everything inside me wanted to sob. Instead, I tried to maintain composure. I'm trying to clear my head. I'm sorry about what happened, Ethan. I was out of line. He nodded, staring at the floor. I might have been harsh too. It's just, personal details are tricky for me. My friend here is just someone from out of town who needed help with some errands. I'm not here for business. Not tonight. A silence stretched. Then, in a move I still can't fully explain, I took his hand. His eyes flicked up, searching my face. That old connection flared, the tension intensifying in the bar's dim light. We ended up stepping outside into the crisp night air, talking in hushed tones. He admitted he missed me, worried if I was okay. I confessed how bleak I felt since we parted ways. It wasn't a full reconciliation, just two lonely people acknowledging the bond they had. He told me he'd come to the B&B later if I wanted to talk. That night, back in my little lace-curtained room, I heard a soft knock. My heart soared. I let him in, and we shared an emotional conversation that escalated into one of the most urgent, intense, intimate moments we'd ever experienced. The knowledge that this might be the last time made it all the more passionate. While it didn't magically fix the rift between us, it gave a sort of bittersweet closure. We fell asleep entwined, understanding that we couldn't keep up this charade forever, no matter how good it felt in fleeting moments. Final meeting. In the hotel restaurant. Some time passed before we saw each other again, this time by mutual agreement. I was scheduled to stay at a boutique hotel near the Magnificent Mile for a teacher's retirement luncheon. I texted Ethan, inviting him for coffee in the hotel's restaurant, not sure if he'd say yes. To my relief, he agreed. I arrived early, wearing a modest blouse and skirt, trying to appear as normal and respectable as possible. That's when a waitress approached me with a wide smile, saying, "Miss Thompson? I'm Michelle, you taught me math in high school. Do you remember?" She proceeded to recount how strict I'd been, how she once felt intimidated by my stern demeanor. My cheeks warmed as I thought about the double life I'd been leading. Ethan appeared shortly after. I introduced him to Michelle as an old friend. My voice shook slightly. The waitress left us alone, but not without a curious glance. When we settled at a small table, I cleared my throat, telling Ethan I'd asked him here because I wanted closure. I explained how he'd awakened a side of me I didn't realize existed, how his companionship had pulled me from a spiral of sadness. Yet I also admitted I'd overstepped boundaries and caused him pain. He listened, nodding gravely. "Sarah, I've had a lot of time to think too. I'm actually thinking about leaving this line of work. Maybe even going back to school, finishing my degree. This job has given me financial stability, but it's complicated." My heart ached with pride and sadness. "That's wonderful. You deserve a life you can be proud of." I paused, gathering courage. "Look, I also realize what we had can't continue indefinitely, even if I wanted it to. It's unfair to both of us, especially given our age gap and the lies I've told. My real name is not something I lied about, but maybe the person I pretended to be, a composed older widow, wasn't the full truth. I'm more broken than I ever let on." Ethan reached for my hand across the table. "Thank you for telling me. I respect your honesty. We're both flawed, Sarah. But we found each other in a strange way. Maybe that was fate's plan to shake us awake." Just then, Michelle returned, leaning in to timidly remind me of how I once reprimanded her and her classmates for giggling with some boys after class. She apologized for having failed to meet my high expectations. My stomach twisted. If only she knew the scandal swirling beneath this calm facade. I decided in that moment to show kindness. I told her we all make choices in life and that I'd likely been too strict back then. She left looking relieved. As for Ethan and me, we ended up going to my room for one last conversation. Truly the last one. We sat on the bed, each leaning against a tall stack of pillows. He hesitated, then told me about his family history in more detail. How his father was never around, how his mother's abandonment shaped his inability to open up. Tears slid down his cheeks as he admitted how ironically he tried to fill that void through fleeting encounters with older women. Women who paid him, but also gave him maternal warmth. Hearing this tore at my heart. I apologized for having judged him or intruded on his privacy. Then he apologized again for walking away so harshly. We shared a final tender embrace that escalated into a bittersweet intimacy. Our tears mingled with whispered confessions of gratitude. When it was over, I felt no regret, just a deep sense that we'd come full circle. "I'll never forget you," I told him, voice quivering. "You made me feel young again, Ethan, like I could break free from the chains of my own past." He smiled through his sadness. "And you showed me I could care about someone, really care, and not just go through the motions." We decided to part amicably. No more illusions about continuing our arrangement. I insisted he keep the fee from our earlier sessions. He declined, but I pressed the envelope into his hand. "Use it for that next step in your life," I said. Finally, we said goodbye, leaving me alone in the quiet room that smelled faintly of the cologne he'd worn. The almost imperceptible shift. A professional perspective. I sat there on the bed for a long time after he left, replaying each moment in my mind, from our first meeting to this last farewell. My heart felt heavy yet oddly liberated. In the following days, I found myself confiding in a counselor, someone I trusted from my teaching days who'd later become a licensed psychologist. Here is the gist of what such a professional might say. When someone has experienced profound loneliness or grief, like losing a spouse or drifting away from family, they often look for dramatic ways to feel alive again. Sometimes that leads to an unconventional relationship, such as a hired companion. The relationship can fill emotional voids and provide a rush of excitement. But it also stirs up guilt, shame, and confusion about boundaries. From a psychological standpoint, it's crucial to practice these steps. Self-reflection. Ask yourself what you truly desire. Emotional closeness, novelty, self-discovery. Understanding your motives helps you make more conscious choices. Acknowledge guilt and shame. Accept that it's normal to feel conflicted, especially if societal norms or personal values condemn such an arrangement. Recognizing these feelings is a step toward dealing with them in a healthier way. Establish boundaries. Even in a consensual, paid dynamic, each person deserves privacy and respect. Crossing those lines can lead to hurt, as both parties in my story discovered. Consider the future. Temporary passion can be intoxicating. But think ahead. What do I want my life to look like in a year or 5? Short-term fulfillment might not align with long-term well-being. Seek support. Whether it's a therapist, close friend, or trusted advisor, having someone to confide in helps untangle the emotional knots such a relationship can create. In my own journey, I learned that you can't outrun loneliness simply by throwing yourself into an affair, paid or otherwise. True healing involves understanding the root of your emptiness. And while the company of someone like Ethan awakened me to life's possibilities, it also highlighted how vulnerable I was, and still am, to illusions. I realized I do have the capacity to love again, but I also have a responsibility to treat both myself and the other person with honesty and dignity. Looking back, do I regret it? Part of me struggles with shame, wishing I had found a more conventional path to reignite my heart. Yet another part of me is grateful that I dared to step out of my comfort zone. I took a risk, discovered passion, and faced the consequences. It's a chapter of my life I'll never forget. But it's also a stepping stone, not a destination. If you, dear listener, ever find yourself in a similar situation, torn between the desire to feel and the fear of judgment, remember this. You are not alone. Many people grapple with forbidden attraction, with unconventional arrangements, with the overwhelming need to be touched, seen, and valued. The important thing is to approach your own vulnerabilities with compassion. Strive for authenticity, and do your best not to harm yourself or others. In the end, life is too fleeting to live without ever taking a chance. But it's also too precious to be careless with our hearts, and the hearts of those who cross our paths.